I am Brian Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and coordinator of the House of Learning Lectures. We welcome students, colleagues, faculty, and invited guests here today to hear Professor Jeff Maughan from the Department of Plant and Wildlife Sciences deliver an address entitled Case Studies in Genetics, Adventures in Science. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lectures and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lectures. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lectures series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's lecturer. Professor Jeff Maughan is a geneticist. He received his Bachelor of Science degree and his Master of Science degree in agronomy at BYU before completing a PhD in molecular genetics from Virginia Tech in 1994. After receiving his doctorate, he worked for 2 years as a postdoctoral scientist at the University of Illinois, developing improved methods for genetically modifying soybeans, and subsequently accepted a position with the Monsanto Corporation in 1997, managing a genotype facility in beautiful downtown Ankeny, Iowa, which is just north of Des Moines if you want to get there. Professor Maughan returned to BYU in 2002 and continued his research on developing solutions to world food problems by using cutting-edge technologies in plant genomics and biotechnology. The author of over a dozen research articles, Professor Maughan mentors BYU Life Sciences students in creating molecular genetic techniques which aid conventional breeding of underproducing crops in developing countries. A dedicated researcher and scientist who always has time for his students, it is with great pleasure that we welcome today the House of Learning lecturer, Professor Jeff Maughan.
Thanks, Brian. I'm happy to come and talk with the students here. And as I prepared this lecture, it made me think of my own family as I think about genetics and as I try to instill upon my students this idea that there's a common thread that runs through all of us. Surely we're all Heavenly Father's children, but there's even more to it than that. Our DNA ties us and binds us together. So I have up here as my first picture, just a picture of my family. And boy, they're good looking, aren't they? They got most of their genetics from me, not my wife. That's funny, you guys. Come on. We know that it's half and half. And what I want to do today is I start to think about genetics, and as I put together these presentations, these slides, I really wanted to give you guys a story. I want you guys to leave after this 45 minutes having learned something about genetics, and I want to convince you that genetics touches every part of your lives and that it has touched history as we know it and will touch history as we go forward. So with that, let me just begin. Where did genetics start? What are the first ideas in genetics? The first ideas that came out in genetics was from a fellow named Hippocrates. And he came up with this concept of pangenesis. And these are just interesting to me the ideas that they had going forward. Pangenesis is this idea that you guys all had little gemules. That's what they were called, little body parts. You had little arms inside of you, little legs inside of you, little necks, and they were all congregating into your reproductive organs. And of course, when you had children, you passed on some of your gemules to your children, as did your spouse. And that's why your children looked a little bit like you and a little bit like your wife or your husband, whatever would be in the case. But that was the idea that was in vogue for, we're talking centuries. It really isn't until Mendel's time in the 1800s that we get clarification on what's really happening in our own heredity. The other idea that's come about at that time was preformationism from Aristotle. Aristotle says everything was made at the time of the creation in those 6 days. So wasn't every human being also created? And if you look at the early drawings, the idea was that inside of either the egg or the sperm were little men called homunculuses. And if you looked hard enough inside of that little homunculus was another little homunculus, because all mankind was created at the days of creation. And I'll be honest with you guys, at first, when Leeuwenhoek, the first microscope inventor, looked inside of a sperm, he saw something. And he thought for sure that he had seen a homunculus. He said, aha, it's there. It must be that Aristotle was right. And I want you guys to know that with the best microscopes we have today, we look inside of sperm and egg, nothing there. But it did set off some very interesting stories. So we're thinking right around the time of Napoleon. Napoleon's thinking about these new inventions, the microscope. Leeuwenhoek says, look, there's little guys inside of the sperm. And of course he thinks to himself, why is it that we have some individuals that are born with what we would call today genetic abnormalities? And he's thinking to himself, well, the sperm has the little man and it's placed into the woman, and the woman is the incubator. Aha, I bet it has something to do with the development of that little homunculus, and that over time, if she is denied something that she needs when she's developing that child, then the child comes out somewhat deformed with a genetic alteration. So this is true. Napoleon Bonaparte put into law that women, as long as they are pregnant, could shoplift. It's true. That way you wouldn't have to worry about having any wants or needs. Shoplift to your hair's delight. Of course, it just didn't work out that way, did it? He's close. I mean, both of these, Aristotle and Hippocrates, are thinking down the right chain, but they don't quite have it right. And indeed, if you guys look through the most powerful microscopes today, you're not going to see little homunculuses in there. And Leeuwenhoek, at the end of the day, actually got rid of this theory. Well, we're still left then with only pangenesis. This is Hippocrates' idea that you have these little body parts that are going to merge together to create a new individual. The person I want you to think about as we go forward here is the next geneticist, the next most prominent one, is Lamarck. And Lamarck says, I can add to this idea of gemules just a little bit. And of course, I like what he writes here. He says, time and favorable conditions are the two principal means which nature has employed in giving existence to all of her productions. We know that for her, time has no limit, and that consequently, she always has it at her disposal. He's adding to this idea the idea of evolutionary time. Time is something that can be worked for in genetics. Think ahead a little bit to your guys' ideas on Darwinian evolution, where he uses time to explain change. Lamarck is pretty close in these ideas, and this is, of course, about 50 years before Darwin publishes his great manuscript on the origin of species. He's close, but he's not quite there, and the reason he's not quite there is because he believes that acquired characteristics can be passed on, okay? He's thinking that this giraffe, he eats the lowest branches of the tree, he has to stretch his neck. And as he stretches his neck to get to the next one, he produces new gemules, new little neck body parts that are bigger, okay? And those get passed on to the child. And of course, over time, we've changed that child. Given enough time, enough changes in attitude, actions, behavior. I go out to the gym, I bulk up, I get big muscles. All of a sudden, I've got a new set of gemules I can pass on to my child. Well, once again, I'm here to dispel that and say to you that that isn't quite how it works. Something is being passed on, but you don't get to modify it, or at least modify it very much. You're not going to pass on those big Arnold Schwarzenegger arms to your child. So Lamarck is close, but he's not quite there yet. Of course, at the same time, you know, 1860s, you know, Darwin is publishing his records. And he's saying, you know what? It's a little bit different than this concept of just being able to change your behavior, change your gemules, and then affect the outcome of your progeny. He's saying there's something more to it. There's actually a natural cause, something called selection. And that's, of course, what he's very famous for, this idea of natural selection, selecting those best individuals and then propagating those individuals because they're more reproductively successful. So he's pretty close, but he doesn't know how to explain the change himself. Why is it that some individuals have a different variant for a particular trait? He assumes, because it's the only theory sitting out there, that it must be due to gemules. Something is changing, it's acquired, and now we're going to be able to select for it in nature. He's very close, but he still has some holes in his theory. Well, pretty soon after Darwin and his ideas, you have a fellow named Augusta Weitzman. Augusta Weitzman says, you know, it isn't gemules. There aren't little body parts running around in your body, congregating in your reproductive organs. It's more than that. And you have to think beyond that. He says it's really just a chemical. Of course, he's thinking DNA. He didn't know that. He calls it germplasm, but he's saying there's a chemical substance that is being passed on from generation to generation. And that's really what's happening. In fact, he goes as far as to disprove gemules definitively. He takes a rat, he cuts off its tail. The new gemule should have no tails, but yet every rat that he breeds from these tailless rats have tails. Of course, the society around him says, well, you know what it is? There's just a pile of gemules stacked up that already have the tails. So he cuts off tails of rats for 20 generations. And you guys all know what happened. After 20 generations, all the rats have tails. And he disproves, you know, definitively that gemules really don't exist, but that something is being passed on. Not sure quite what it is, but he's getting closer to this idea that it's chemical in nature. Of course, contemporary to Darwin is Mendel. Mendel is, of course, famous as the father of genetics. And I'll tell you a couple stories about Mendel. I want to digress a little bit as we talk about Mendel, just because he's so important to my study in genetics and to any geneticists that are out there. We call him the father of genetics for a reason. But you have to realize he's in a unique place in history. The idea behind Hippocrates and homunculuses, that's gone. The idea behind gemules and Aristotle, that's gone. The most prevailing theory out there is that, hey, there's an observation that when you cross a black dog with a white dog, you get a gray dog. So maybe whatever this thing is that Weitzman calls germplasm, these chemicals that come together from both sides of the cross, they blend together to create the gray dog. And so the idea was blending. Whatever function it is that's out there comes together, blends together, and then, of course, you get whatever the intermediate or the mediocrity point is. Of course, Mendel looked at that and he said, this is a real problem for Darwin. If everything blends to mediocrity to a middle point, how in the world do you get extremes that are going to be selected by nature or artificially by man? So he has a real problem with this. And of course, Mendel's story is even more interesting than that. He's poor. He's born to a very poor family in the Czech Republic. His parents use his sister's dowry, the money that she's going to use to be married with, to send him off to school. He's obviously smart, but he's not a very good test taker. I'm looking at some of my students out there, and they know how he felt, you know. So he has some problems, but he's in school. He's at a monastery, okay? And that's, of course, where you would go to get learning. All the best libraries were held by the monks. If you were in the aristocracy, you would hire a monk to come teach your children. They are the house of learning, if you would, during these times. And so he's sent to this monastery. His ambition in life is to be quote-unquote, a teacher in science. That's what he really loves. But of course, he can't pass his test to become a real teacher. So he ends up being a substitute teacher until his abbot, a fellow named Abbot Knapp, comes to him and says, look, you know, why don't you go attend the University of Vienna? Vienna is the crossroads of the world, if you think in terms of Europe at that time. It's a very famous university. And he says, sure, I'll go to university and study up. Maybe then I can pass my teaching certificate. At the University of Vienna, he's very lucky in two ways. And I think it has application to us as students as students of science or whatever area of education we're in, he had the opportunity to study with a very famous botanist who taught him about botany, crossing of plants. He taught him about the anatomical features of plants. But he also had the opportunity to work with another very famous physical scientist by the name of Johann Doppler. Many of you guys will know the name. Doppler, of course, is the fellow that we recognize when we look at the Doppler radar. And of course, if you send out radio waves, you can detect how fast they're coming back, and you can determine how fast clouds are moving. Doppler's thinking in terms of modeling the universe around him with numbers. He's thinking about math. He's thinking about numbers. He's thinking about statistics. This is very different for a biological scientist. Up until this point, most biological scientists are simply describing the world around them in terms of how many plants there were in this area, what color were those plants, certainly not thinking about models. Mendel changes that. He turns it on his head. When he comes back to the monastery, he retakes his exam, and you guys all know he failed again. Doesn't never rise above a substitute teacher, never gets his teaching certificate. I like to tell my students they do have a chance, even if they fail my class, that they're going to be famous. This is a very rare chance, I tell them, but there is a chance there for you guys after all. So Mendel, to his own credit, is told by his abbot, you love doing that science at your university. Why don't you carry it on here? And he does. And he starts working with those famous pea plants. And what he discovers is that blending doesn't happen. Think about this. He takes a tall parent and a short parent, what we'd call a dwarf parent. He crosses them. They don't become intermediate in size. They're tall. And then when he lets that plant self with itself, i.e. cross with itself, plants can do that, he sees a bunch of tall plants come out and then a dwarf plant. And he says to himself, whatever that was that caused it to be dwarf, it didn't melt into some intermediate point. It was always there, and it was stuck when it was a plant with the other thing that was there. And this other thing, we call them genes, dominated over it. So tall dominates over dwarf. But as soon as you go through meiosis, those things escape those bonds, and all of a sudden, dwarf can play out again depending on who it ends up with as it unites as a gamete. This is meiosis. For a scientist like myself, and thinking about what Mendel had at his disposal, he didn't understand molecular genetics. He had no clue what the cell cycle was. He describes in his 1866 paper, meiosis to the T. He didn't call them genes, he called them factors, but he understood dominance and recessivity. Now, there's lots of traits out there you guys might recognize as being recessive. We worry about things like albinism or phenylketonuria, PKU, or cystic fibrosis. These are recessive types of genes. And so he had figured that out early on. It's interesting. I show you another picture here of the monastery that he worked in at St. Thomas there, and of course his grave. It's interesting that he writes a single paper, this paper on the hybridization of plants that describes what we know as the foundation of all genetics. He writes this paper and then fades from the view of the world. His paper is lost for 35 years. Nobody reads it. Nobody cares about it. We think that he actually sent it on to Darwin. There's a copy in Darwin's library. By the way, if Darwin had read it, and we know he did not, because in the olden days they used to seal it on both sides, and the copy in Darwin's library is sealed still on both sides. But if he had read it, he would have understood how everything works. But anyways, so he dies, and it's interesting that he says, hey, two things kept me from doing more work. The first, I think many of us will appreciate, he went into administration. For all the instructors here, they know that that can be a death trap for researchers. He ends up in administration, and he runs the monastery. That takes a lot of his time away. The other thing I really like here, and let me read to you guys, he says, he put on weight and found it, quote, very difficult for me to do the bending required to cultivate peas in a world where universal gravitation prevails. I like that. It's just too tough. He needed to lose some weight. He went to his doctor, and his doctor, of course, aptly prescribed to him to smoke. And I think you guys would see that that's a general effect of smoking. Oftentimes individuals will lose weight. He obliged and smoked 20 cigars a day. He dies just 20 years later of heart disease. But I like at least this quotation from him. Even though I had gone through a number of bitter times in my life, I must thankfully own that the pleasant and the good prevailed. My scientific work brought me a great deal of satisfaction, and I am convinced that it will not long before the whole world recognizes it. I mean, he's a visionary. Plus, he's thankful for what he has. I like this about this guy. Okay, let's move on a little bit further. His work is lost. I'm moving you guys now up to the 1900s, early 1900s. Nobody knows about his work, and three fellows at the same time rediscover Mendel's work. And the fellow I want to talk to you about is de Vries. The other fellows are Karl Karens and Tejermak, and then de Vries here, rediscover his work. As they prepare their manuscripts, they do a literature search. And lo and behold, they find Mendel's quote-unquote ancient manuscript. It's 35 years old, but they recognized that Mendel had already discovered everything they had just spent the last few years discovering themselves. And in a quirky sense, they give him credit. That's quirky to me because they could have just ignored him and claimed it for themselves. But all three of them agree Mendel should be given the credit. Wow, that's interesting to me that somebody would do that. But de Vries adds to our story just a little bit more. De Vries is walking through his fields there in Europe, and he's walking amongst primrose plants, evening primrose. Evening primrose plants are actually native to the New World, to the Americas. And they were brought over to the Old World, and they propagated on their own. But they were all of one color, or generally of one color. But yet he noticed that as he walked around a field of, say, purple-colored primrose plants, there was a yellow one, or one of a different color. And it got him thinking, how in the world did that new variant get there? And he discovers at that time a theory he calls the saltation theory, which is mutation. He's now saying that Augusta Weitzman's germplasm, DNA, can change. Add that to Darwin's theory of evolution and selection, you now have a platform for building out Darwinian evolution over time, as Lamarck said it would be. So these great guys are the founders of genetics. Now, I just want to go a little bit further with you guys and say mutations, these things that de Vries is describing, are not new. Of course they're not new. They've been happening forever and ever since the dawn of time, and natural selection has been working upon them. Here's a case I just wanted to give you guys to prove that to you. Used to be that sheep were very long-legged. Imagine, you're a sheep in the wild, you're living up in the rocks, you had to have long legs to jump over here and there. Well, in 1791, a sheep breed, somebody had a baby lamb, and that lamb had a mutation that caused it to have small legs. This would have been in England, probably on the Irish coast. You guys think with me for a minute. The Irish coast, I'm thinking windswept bluffs. I'm thinking green, but not trees. I'm thinking pastures. And indeed, if you run sheep in these areas, you have to pin them in somehow. How do you pin them in? You pin them in with fences made of rock. So, if you had sheep who had short legs, isn't that what you want? You don't have to build quite as high a fence with those rocks. And so, very quickly, after man-made what we'd call artificial selection, we began to breed and propagate through artificial selection these short-legged breed types. I think that's interesting and certainly tells me something. Now, the other thing I want to dispel from you guys right now is that all mutation is bad. Of course, that would not work in the confines and the architecture of Darwinian evolution. It certainly would not. You think here for a minute about this picture. This is a picture of Abraham Lincoln with his generals. He's got George B. McClellan there, another general, next to him. And the thing that steps out to me is the height of Lincoln. And in fact, it wasn't very long ago that a number of individuals tried to get a hold of Abraham Lincoln's tissues because they thought he suffered from a very unique genetic disorder called Marfan's disease, Marfan syndrome. And that's a mutation that occurs in the FBN1 gene. Turns out that he really doesn't suffer from this. Two interesting points about this whole case is, one, do we really need to know if Abraham Lincoln suffered from some genetic disease? I'm not sure, but it's certainly a good bioethical question. Turns out that we didn't allow this to be tested up front. Later on, we began to look at his extended family, and we determined that he doesn't suffer from Marfan syndrome. But Marfan syndrome is a mutation in the fibrillin that links together your joints. And so if you look at descriptions of Lincoln, he had an awkward gait, an elongated gait. These would be functions of having this problem. Well, there are other people that are thought to also have the same mutation, one of which would be Niccolo Paganini. Now, I'm not a violinist, but the descriptions of Paganini is that his wrist was so loose that he could move and twist it in all directions. Once again, thinking that he might have actually suffered from this recessive genetic mutation that caused fibrilin to break down. But this is what I really like, and I apologize, I'm going to take a second just to pull this open. Listen to what this mutation allowed him to be able to do. I'm certainly not a violinist, but I can see the genius. And if it indeed was due to a mutation, wow, positive. So mutations come in all forms. I hope I've dispelled that idea that all mutations are negative. Indeed, they cannot be if indeed evolution works to select the best there. Paganini, I'm amazed at that ability. Okay, I need to introduce you guys to just a couple more players in the game, and then we can go on to think about some of these cases. The next guy that I wanted to introduce you to is a fellow named Sutton. And Sutton and another fellow, Bouvier, actually discover that DNA, this germplasm that Augusta Weitzman is talking to us, that is passed on from one generation to the next generation, and that can be mutated, as De Vries tells us, he says it's on chromosomes. And the way he figured this out is he's looking through a microscope, and he sees chromosomes, what he called chromatin, come together and move apart during the cell cycle as it goes through meiosis. And of course, those of you guys who have taken a basic biology course know that as we go through the reproductive cycle of meiosis, homologous chromosomes, you have a chromosome 1 from your mom and a chromosome 1 from your dad, those line up together on the metaphase plate, and then they divide into gametes, into egg or sperm, depending on what your sex is. He looked in a microscope, and he saw these factors coming together and moving apart, and he thought, these are the same things that Mendel described. Remember, Mendel says things don't blend, they come together, and they must interact with each other while they're together inside of us, but as they go through meiosis, they must escape those bonds of interaction and start afresh. He's proven to himself that indeed this must be where genes are, where DNA is, the chromosomes. So he's made a very important discovery. A little bit later on, not very many years later, Thomas Morgan, who's very famous for his ideas in genetics, discovers the idea again, and he says, look, the genes that control sex appear to be on an X chromosome. Now, think about it for all you who are not geneticists in the group with me. Men in this room have an X and a Y. The X is very big, the Y is very small. You don't have the same genes on the X and the Y. So women in this room have two X's. You actually have a copy of every one of your genes on the X chromosome from both your mom and your dad. So if you receive a recessive, a mutated copy from your mom, your dad can probably overcome that. But men who get their X chromosome from their mom, they get the Y from their dad. If they receive a mutated X chromosome for whatever gene, they are going to express it. And he saw this occurring in Drosophila melanogaster, fruit flies. And of course, I can show you that same thing happening in history. I can show it to you with Queen Victoria and her family. And what I really like to show you guys here is Victoria is a carrier because she has two X's, but she has one that's mutated for hemophilia. This is a disease that if you have a mutated hemophilia gene, you can't produce blood clotting factor. And if you get cut, you'll bleed out, you'll die. And if you look, it's normally the men that show this. The squares that are filled in, these are all men. Circles are women. But you notice only the women are carriers, and the men are the ones who express it. Look also behind there is the age in which they die. You'll notice they die fairly young. We only have one case where somebody dies very old out here. And of course, we pass, or I should say, Queen Victoria passes this gene through this lineage all the way down to Alexandria, who becomes the Empress of Russia, and then her son, the Tsarevich Alexei. And Alexei is unfortunately diseased with hemophilia. And what I want to tell you guys here is the family is just completely distraught about this. Alexandria is distraught about this, and she goes in search of people that can heal her child. Who does she find? Rasputin, Gregory Rasputin, who's a monk, at least he claims he can heal. But as he got into the family, it appears that he did something good for this child at least once, because the family began to believe in him and his powers. But at the end of the day, he actually gets involved in affairs of state, and he causes the family to be, if you would, ostracized from the Senat and from the Duma, the ruling party, if you would, of the Congress of Russia and then the Church of Russia. And so they become ostracized from the Russian people. And as I write here, it didn't take very long before they were ostracized from their own people, and the Russian Revolution occurs, the Bolshevik Revolution. They're carried off into, well, nobody knew for 80 years, because the Lenin government and the Stalin government wouldn't say what happened to the Romanov family. We later find out that they were pulled off into Siberia, and then finally the white Russians that are out there are coming to rescue them, and the rural Russians kill them in the dead of night, kill all the family. Or so we now know. But of course, you guys all know and have heard the stories. They've been made into movies about Anastasia. Anastasia is this young lady right here. And of course, there's been claims that she escaped the brutal murder of her family. And there's been individuals who have claimed to be heirs to the throne, if you would, through Anastasia. It turns out that genetics solves the puzzle today. We dug up their graves. It was in a very shallow grave. They were burnt to try to dispose of the bodies, but we were able to collect tissue from each one of the remains in the grave, and we've identified through genetic markers that every one of those individuals in the grave were family members, and that accounts for everybody in the Romanov family. So I like this idea. It's changed history by the Bolshevik Revolution, and then genetics clarifies history for us in 1991, when people felt safe again in Russia, of course, because the wall came down. Well, let's go on a little bit further. The case I want to talk to you guys about now is eugenics. Now, eugenics usually connotates some very negative feelings among us all, but I want to give you guys the background and formulate it in terms of genetics for you. It was Francis Galton who coined the term eugenics, meaning good in birth. Now, Francis Galton is actually the younger cousin of Darwin. So he's read Darwin's work. He knows about selection. He's thinking in his mind, as does much of Europe at this time. Remember what's happening in Europe right around Darwin's time? We have the great industrialization. The rabble is coming into the cities. And he looks around him, as does the rest of the aristocracy, and he sees this mass amount of people, and they're breeding. They're having more peasants. And of course, the aristocracy is concerned. They've read Darwin's work, and they know that they're going to be flooded by bad genes. Because for sure, these peasants have bad genes, or they wouldn't be peasants. You see the problem here with the thinking that started off early on. Of course, Galton says, hey, it's easy to obtain by careful selection a permanent breed of dog or horses gifted with a peculiar power of running or of doing anything else, so it would be quite practicable to produce a highly gifted race of man by judicious marriages during several consecutive generations. He's using Darwin's idea of selection, natural artificial selection, and he's saying, shouldn't this be applicable to man? Now, he is not suggesting, and nor did he, that these poor individuals, these peasants, shouldn't be allowed to have children. He's just saying, can't we think about having better marriages, and those that are clean or fittest, shouldn't they be having more children so we don't get a wash in these bad genes? We go on a little bit further, and you have to realize that it was in the Americas, specifically the United States, where offices of eugenics were opened up. At state fairs, you guys, we used to have awards and prizes given to the fittest family, ones without bad genes. And this is just interesting to me. And of course, they'd gather and take their pictures around. You can see one here. Of course, this seems crazy to us, but you got to put yourself in their shoes. They're thinking this is also true. In fact, we opened up at one of the most famous laboratories in the United States, Cold Spring Harbor. Most of the scientists out here will recognize that name. There was actually a whole directorate of eugenics where they went out and they tried to map genes that were involved in particular traits. They thought they were mapping genes like albinism, which is very easy to do and real. thinking about PKU, they could do that as well. But they also started to map genes as far as musical ability, inventiveness, boat building skill. That's not inherited. But they thought they were. They thought banking would be inherited. Isn't it? I'm a banker. My son's a banker. Therefore, there's a gene. No idea that you have this nature and nurture dichotomy occurring here. And you've got to mix both of those things together in order. The banker's son has much more opportunity to be a banker. Has nothing to do with his genes per se. Okay, so we're living in that. I want to convince you that the Americas are just as much a party to this as Europe soon will be. Of course, another thing starts to happen that turns eugenics from good breeding to let's restrict those who are peasants, those who are feeble-minded, those who are sexual degenerates from breeding. And of course, this happens with a very famous case called the Kallikak case. And Kallikak is really a pseudonym. It's really a fictional name for a family, and it comes from good and bad. Kali meaning good and kak meaning bad in Greek. But if you look at this family, what they had was a revolutionary soldier that was studied by a fellow named Henry Goddard. Okay, Henry Goddard's famous for developing the first IQ test, by the way. Henry Goddard looks at this family's pedigree, and he notices something very interesting. Here's the revolutionary soldier. He marries lawfully this woman here, who's considered normal. That's what the N is for. And they produce, a whole bunch of normal children. He goes off to war, and he gets involved in an affair with what they say, at least in the historical text, with a barmaid wench. And they have a child. And they say that she was feeble-minded, and they have a feeble-minded child. This feeble-minded child marries again, and look at all these children. They're not only feeble-minded, they're alcoholics, they're sexual deviants, and so forth. Surely this shows us that good genes are inherited as well as bad genes. So we need to do something about that. And we look a little bit further in time. Oh, let me go back. They ask Goddard what should be done in them. And Goddard makes the first reference to forced sterilization, as I show you guys to be right here. Sterilization may be accepted as the makeshift to get us through this period. He wasn't all excited about this, but at least he puts into the general vernacular, maybe we should restrict feeble-minded people from passing on their genes. Indeed, it's Harry Sharp at the same time who's a prison doctor who cures somebody of sexual degeneracy by sterilization. That makes sense to me that it would work, but he says to Congress, to the local state Congress there, look, we can solve the problem of sexual degeneracy just by simply forcing sterilization. All of a sudden, this sounds like a great idea. And in fact, he was such a good lobbyist that he got 30 states to agree to force sterilization of what we call the feeble-minded people in insane asylums, okay? Sexual degenerates in prison. And in fact, by 1941, we had a total of, 60,000 sterilizations occurring. This idea was actually challenged in court by these ladies over here. This is Carrie Buck and her mother, Emma. And it was Buck versus the state where they challenged whether forced sterilization was reasonable to do. And it was the great Oliver Wendell Holmes who writes in his final decree on this method, it is better for the world if, instead of waiting to execute the degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit, from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. You can see the problem that we have here. This is right at the same time that you have the ascent of Adolf Hitler into power. And in fact, the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, the director has been flown over to Germany to lecture about eugenics. Lots of things are going on in the world that are based in genetics at this time. And of course, you have Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, where he says explicitly, the state must declare unfit for propagation all who are in any way visibly sick or who have inherited disease and can therefore pass it on, and put into actual practice. You can see this has become a very slippery slope. And of course, it culminates in the Holocaust. He starts off first by saying, hey, these are unfit, as he says down here, these are unfit and of too much trouble. We shouldn't do sterilizations. Let's move on to something else. Just get rid of them. They're useless eaters. And he begins killing everyone in the insane asylums and the mental retardation hospitals. And finally, this culminates to a slip over to the Holocaust of the Jews, who are useless themselves, and the what we'd say the gypsies, in his mind at least. This is the apogee, if you would, of eugenics as we understand it today. Certainly, this is not accepted by all scientists. The co-founder of evolution, Alfred Wallace, condemns eugenics as simply the meddlesome interference of an arrogant scientific priestcraft. I like that. There were good scientists out there who were saying this was a wrong thing to be doing. But I hope that I've shown you that, wow, genetics has really changed history from the Romanov family all the way through to the Holocaust. And it's based in genetics. For me as a geneticist, I love this kind of stuff. I'm looking up here I have a whole 5 minutes left before I run out of time, but I can't go much further without mentioning to you guys the very famous James Watson and Francis Crick, who discovered the double helix. They're very famous for telling us that. Now, I want to give you guys a couple case studies to make you think going forward. Now, here's a child in 2004 that was shown to have some very unique musculature. You can see as a neonate, at 7 months, you can see these pronounced here and pronounced here. This child has extreme musculature. And the medical community was very interested in this. And they realized that what he had was a mutation in one of his genes that controlled musculature. The way your muscles grow is that they're controlled in a negative way. As the muscles grow, once they get big enough, we release a protein called myostatin. If you don't release that protein, they continue to grow. So we're all controlling our muscle via myostatin. If you don't control it, you get extreme musculature. You can actually see this running through this patient's family. But what I think is interesting here, for those of you who are younger than I am in this room, should this guy be allowed to play baseball? I'm thinking World Series today. Isn't he going to be able to throw like 120-mile-an-hour fastball? Isn't he going to be able to be the world's best football running back because of this? What are the bioethics behind this? Now, I also want to convince you that these types of mutations bind us not only as a human family, but as a living family. So this same gene that controls musculature in men, in women, in us, controls the same musculature in dogs. And you can, of course, see here, these are running dogs. This dog's pretty good. It's normal. It has the normal myostatin. This dog here has one of its copies is mutated, and this is the dog you want. It's the fastest dog. This is not the dog you want. Both of its copies of its myostatin are broken. It can't run very fast. It's double muscled. Well, the same gene that works in us works in dogs. We are related. Now, is it just restricted to us and dogs? Certainly not. Works in animals, other. This is a blue Belgium, double muscle, same mutations, myostatin in cattle. Okay. How about this one? This is a gene that controls fast twitch muscles. So you have something that constricts in your muscle, and it's controlled by actin. Okay. If you have a mutation in this, you can't constrict very fast, but you have endurance. And if you look at individuals, here you guys are, who are Olympic athletes here, you have both types of genes. But if you look over here, the best power athletes in the world, they have to be able to constrict fast. These are the sprinters. They got to move fast. If they don't have actin, they're not going to work very fast. But on the other end, if you're an endurance athlete, you don't want to have a quick snatch and pull, fast twitch muscles. You want to have long endurance. Now, the question I have for you is one day you guys are going to have children. You're going to want them to go into track and field. Are you going to test them? It's certainly a possibility. Why would you put your child who is on this side into an endurance medium? Better to put them into a sprint. Wouldn't you like to? Well, is that legal? Is that fair? Is that the right thing to do? Now, I can see I've already ran out of time, and I have 3 more cases. So you're going to have to attend my classes if you're ever going to want to see the rest of the cases. I think at that, I've explained enough about genetics and how it's affected us and how it's going to affect us going forward. So I'll leave it at that.